Night drapes itself over Constantinople like a slow velvet curtain, and somewhere along the Theodosian walls a young princess stands at a narrow window, pretending she is only watching the torches while secretly counting the steps of a particular guard below. She tells herself it is simple curiosity, the harmless kind you're allowed when you're born into purple robes and heavy expectations. Yet her gaze keeps returning to the same steady figure, the one who never leans, never slouches, never quite belongs to the shadows. The city hums beneath her, bronze bells, distant market laughter, the faint salt of the Bosphorus sneaking through stone, and she thinks that if her tutors knew what she was doing, they'd probably schedule extra theology until you won't survive this for weeks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because forced loyalty, she's learned from history lessons, has never ended well for emperors, soldiers or daughters promised to strangers. She imagines you sitting there with your own quiet night pressing at the windows, and she almost smiles at the idea of sharing this secret with you, inviting you to whisper your city and local time, like tiny lanterns blinking on across the map. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because up in this tower room she straightens her shoulders, exhales slowly, and finally admits to herself that she is waiting for him. Below, the guard moves along the rampart walk, armour muted beneath a plain cloak, and while the other soldiers gossip or scratch initials into stone, he walks his route with the calm focus of someone who knows exactly how fragile a wall can really be. Byzantine chroniclers love to write about emperors and patriarchs, about councils and heresies, and which relic processed where on which festival day. Yet she suspects none of them will ever write about this quiet sentinel whose name she has never been told. Still, she's collected details like contraband, the way he shifts his weight before each turn, the small scar along his jaw that catches torchlight, the barely perceptible nod he offers icons as he passes, as if negotiating private treaties with painted saints. Some nights she remembers that Constantinople once withstood sieges that should have shattered it, Greek fire hissing across the water like something out of an overdramatic bedtime story, and she wonders how many nameless men like him made that possible. There is a strange comfort in knowing the capital's great triple walls, studded with towers and gates, are watched by someone who does not seem bored, drunk or distracted, and she feels almost childish for noticing, which her heart frankly ignores. Up close, she's overheard servants describe him as dull, too serious, too quiet for a proper palace anecdote, yet once she caught him laughing with a stable boy, that rare, surprised laugh that escapes before a man remembers he's stone. Historians still argue whether Byzantine princesses truly lived as sheltered as later writers insist, debating diaries, silk inventories and rumoured sightings at races in the hippodrome. But tonight her world is simply the window, the wall, and his measured footsteps. A fringe chronicle she once read mentions a guard who refused a bribe so large it could have bought a vineyard and a small church, and she has decided this must be him, because stories need one stubbornly honest person to stand. Somewhere beyond the city lights, trade ships rock gently in the harbour, carrying spices, coins and gossip from distant shores. Yet in this stillness the most dangerous cargo is the feeling in her chest whenever his shadow crosses her window's edge. Moonlight spills along the palace corridors like watered milk, cool and almost too gentle for a place where whispers can cut sharper than swords. and she moves through them with the careful grace of someone who knows every column hides both marble and rumour. Tonight she drifts toward the portico, overlooking the inner courtyard, pretending she needs fresh air, even though she's chasing the echo of a voice she overheard earlier, his voice, quietly warning another guard that someone in the palace is buying loyalty in secret. She shouldn't have heard it. Princesses aren't supposed to wander unescorted, especially not after dusk. But curiosity is the Empire's most undervalued currency, and hers has grown heavier each night, tugging her toward the places where duty and danger clasp hands. Below, the courtyard feels hushed, as if it has politely stepped aside to let her thoughts pass through. And in that hush she senses the faint metallic click of his scabbard against stone, a small sound that lights her pulse like a lantern wick. He's speaking to no one now, only pacing slow arcs around the fountain, scanning shadows the way a scholar reads marginal notes. And she wonders what threat coils beneath the surface tonight, because his vigilance feels sharpened, almost rearranged by something unseen. Once, her tutor told her Byzantine politics resembled a maze built by a poet. Beautiful, confusing, and always missing one crucial turn. But watching him now, she suspects some people learn that maze by instinct, the way dolphins rid currents without maps. She steps closer to the balustrade, ignoring the part of her mind warning that if a court lady spots her, tomorrow's gossip will bloom like mould on old parchment, and honestly, mould spreads slower than palace rumours, so her odds aren't great. Torches flicker along the peristyle walkway, their light sculpting gold lines across the guard's jaw. And she remembers the way he tightened his voice earlier when warning about the bribe, like a man measuring words he cannot afford to misplace. Historians still argue whether palace guards truly influenced imperial stability as much as chroniclers claim, debating regimental records and troop rotations. But she decides the answer is yes, because this one man's unease feels like a thread tugging at the Empire's hem. A quirky tale she once heard from a bored wet nurse resurfaces, that some guards slept with small copper charms under their pillows to ward off court betrayal, and she wonders whether he keeps one too, or whether honour itself functions as his charm. He pauses suddenly, looking toward the balcony where she stands, hidden between pillars, and for a strangely stretched heartbeat she thinks he sees her, though reason insists he is simply tracing movement among shadows, not searching for a princess out past curfew. Still, something in his posture shifts, a quiet readiness that feels like the prelude to a revelation, and she senses that whatever warning he whispered earlier was not meant for casual ears, but for those willing to face whatever crawls beneath the Empire's marble. A breeze stirs the silk curtains behind her, brushing her spine like a discreet reminder that she's playing a dangerous game. But danger has an odd sweetness tonight, the kind that tastes like possibility instead of doom, which is frankly suspicious. He resumes pacing, slower now, as if listening for footsteps that haven't arrived, and she wonders if someone else knows about that bribe, someone powerful enough to make honesty a liability, which means his life might already be balancing on a hinge. For the first time, she feels an urge to intervene in the story rather than merely observe it, to descend the stairway and offer some impossible warning, but she stays still, gripping cold stone, sensing that something larger than both of them has begun. Night settles heavier along the Golden Horn, turning the water into a dark mirror that catches firelight from distant ship lamps, and she watches from an upper terrace where the breeze tastes faintly of salt, cinnamon, and the secrets she's been gathering like forbidden fruit. The guard stands near a row of stacked torches, their flames swaying in slow arcs that paint bronze threads along his cheek. And in that shifting glow she sees something new, an alertness sharpened by worry, as though danger has stepped closer than courtesy allows. He senses unrest to the east, where the palace walls meet the old arsenals, and though no alarms ring tonight, experience knots between his shoulders, the kind that soldiers trust more than official decrees, which often arrive late enough to be politely useless. She descends a step drawn by a thread she refuses to name, because naming it would make it real, and reality is precisely what royal daughters are trained to avoid unless it comes with a marriage contract attached, and even then enthusiasm is optional. A soft clatter breaks the moment, a torch bracket shifting on its hinge, and he turns his head slightly, hand brushing his sword hilt not in fear but in habit, the quiet instinct of someone who has survived enough nights to listen when metal speaks. Byzantine records mention notorious palace bribes involving foreign envoys and ambitious generals, though scarcity of detail suggests chroniclers enjoyed drama more than accuracy, and she wonders whether the whisper he gave earlier ties into one of these schemes now curling around the empire's ribs. He moves toward the terrace's lower steps, not quite approaching her hiding place but close enough that she notices the faint roughness along his left glove, as though he's recently drawn a blade too quickly, a detail her imagination immediately stretches into several absurd scenarios. Historians still argue whether the Guard factions truly operated as kingmakers in moments of crisis, with some claiming they swayed succession more subtly than council decrees, and she finds herself hoping that if he does hold such influence, he will choose something other than caution tonight. A quirky rumour she once heard from a travelling merchant resurfaces, that some soldiers believed owl calls predicted betrayals, counting hoots like coded warnings, and though she's never taken it seriously, the sudden hoot rising from a nearby cypress tree feels almost theatrically timed. He pauses at the sound, eyes lifting to the tree line, and she wonders if he too has heard that superstition, though his expression reveals nothing but a soldier's discipline, a mask carved from duty and perhaps, tonight, a touch of reluctant concern. The breeze thickens with the promise of approaching rain, drumming faintly against distant rooftops, and for a brief moment she imagines descending the steps, confronting him outright, asking why his warning earlier carried the weight of someone preparing to lose something precious. He adjusts the strap along his shoulder, the quiet scrape of leather against mail ringing in the evening like a distant chime, and she realizes she has memorized these sounds the way poets memorize cadences, storing them in the soft archive behind her heartbeat. The golden horn flickers with reflections of fishing boats drifting home, their lanterns bobbing gently like tired stars, and she senses that whatever danger stalks tonight, it has already woven itself into their stories, tightening threads neither can cut cleanly. He finally turns toward the shadows where she stands, gaze sweeping just wide enough to brush her presence, not quite recognition but something near it, the way someone senses a memory before recalling its name, and her breath catches like parchment decided not to tear. Somewhere behind her, a palace door sighs open, footsteps echoing across polished tiles, and she knows the moment is about to break. But as she steps back into the veil of darkness, she feels the first undeniable shift. Something between them has crossed its threshold. Dawn has not yet broken, but the silk-draped chamber where she sleeps glows with the faintest ember of torchlight leaking through carved lattice work, and she wakes to an unusual stillness, the kind that feels staged, as though the palace itself is holding its breath. Her ladies are absent, strange at this hour, and the air smells faintly of ink, beeswax, and something misaligned, and when she steps toward the low writing table, she sees it. A folded letter, pressed with no seal, placed with theatrical precision atop her mirrored box. She knows instantly this is trouble. Letters without seals in the palace are never harmless, and she opens it with the slow dread of someone lifting the lid of a sleeping serpent, reading a message that suggests her marriage is being arranged sooner than she believes. The handwriting is sharp, elegant, and clearly meant to impress rather than comfort, outlining political plans in a tone of someone who thinks conquest is romantic, and she nearly laughs. Quietly, because reacting loudly to imperial matchmaking is generally discouraged for survival reasons. But beneath the formal lines lies something worse. A second sheet, thinner, bearing a rushed note clearly not meant for her eyes, revealing a conspiracy between a high-ranking cousin and an ambitious nobleman, one that mentioned securing her compliance by any necessary means. Her pulse spikes, staccato and sharp, and she folds the paper back with careful fingers, recognizing immediately that this is connected to the bribe the guard overheard. Proof that someone intends to reshape the court's power like wet clay, starting with her. She moves to hide the letter beneath the cushion, remembering the guard's quiet tension the night before, the way his gaze brushed her like a question he didn't dare ask, and she feels the strange comfort of knowing at least one person isn't plotting something. Historians still argue whether these private documents, mentioned briefly in later chronicles, ever truly existed or were inventions of rival factions, but she knows the truth because it crinkles under her palm. Ink, paper, and the cold fingerprint of ambition. Outside, footsteps echo, a pair measured and cautious, and she freezes, realizing someone is approaching her chambers far too early for propriety, and the voice that murmurs beyond the door belongs to a eunuch known for his allegiance to whoever pays the most. A quirky palace tidbit leaps into her mind, that some servants used to hide love notes inside rolled silk tassels, but she doubts anyone will be braiding sweet nothings today. This morning has the texture of political mischief, not romance, and tassels won't save her. When the door shifts open, she stands poised, back straight, expression arranged into the serene mask expected of a princess, and the eunuch bows with oily politeness, claiming he is here to assist with preparations, which is code for monitor without asking. She nods, dismissing him with icy grace, then watches him vanish into the corridor, knowing he will return soon and that she has only minutes to decide whether to ignore the letter's warning or act upon it before someone removes that choice entirely. The guard flashes in her thoughts, his steady posture, his instinctive vigilance, and without planning to, she moves toward the hidden side passage connecting her chambers to the rear stair, her bare feet soundless on cool mosaic tiles, patterned with stories of saints who also fled danger. As she slips through the narrow archway, clutching the incriminating letter, she feels the palace shift behind her, the way a stage changes scenes while actors reposition, and she understands that if she doesn't find him now, she may never get another chance. And so she descends into the dim stairwell, breath tucked tight beneath her ribs, realizing this is the first irreversible step, because once she tells him what she found, their choices will collapse into a single path, one lined with exile, storms, and a devotion neither dared name. She slips from the palace's rear gate under a sky bruised with early twilight, and when she finds him waiting by the disused postern, alert, cloak drawn tight, he understands everything without words, because the letter trembling in her hand confirms the betrayal he sensed threading through the corridors like smoke others politely pretended not to smell. He leads her into the narrow service tunnel once used by gardeners carrying tools, a passage so cramped she can feel his breath steadying her steps. And though fear needles her spine, she trusts the rhythm of his movement, the certainty in his voice as he explains which guard rotations tonight contain men who are loyal rather than merely convenient. The tunnel opens into a courtyard once reserved for imperial horses, now abandoned except for moss and forgotten saddles. And as they cross it carefully, he murmurs that history records emperors escaping through this very yard during uprisings, though scholars still debate whether those accounts exaggerate the chaos to make loyalists seem more heroic than bewildered. He stops her near a stone trough, lifting a loose slab to reveal a small cache. Bread, water, a dagger, and a thin bronze icon of St. Mercurius, and she stares, realizing he has prepared for flight long before tonight, which is both comforting and mildly alarming in the way good planning can resemble prophecy. A quirky detail he shares, almost apologetically, is that some old guards claimed the icon protected travellers from storms if placed facing the wind, and though she is not especially superstitious, she tucks it gently into her sash, deciding that tonight she will welcome any help, sacred or otherwise. They slip through an orchard behind the stables, dodging low branches and the occasional startled cat, and when they reach the outer wall's sally port, he signals for silence because this gate is monitored by two men rumoured to gamble away pay faster than they earn it, which could be helpful or disastrous. He times their movement perfectly, leading her through the narrow opening when both guards turn to argue about whose turn it is to fetch wine, and she almost laughs because the Empire's fate, at least in this moment, seems to hinge on two men squabbling like children over chores. Outside the walls, the night expands into a vast wind-washed plain, where Constantinople glows behind them like a jewelled throne abandoned mid-ceremony, and he glances back once, the weight of loyalty and treason clashing in his expression, aware that with one step he is crossing the invisible border between soldier and outlaw. Historians still argue whether this was the night the princess vanished abruptly from all official records, noting that chroniclers became suspiciously vague about her movements. But the truth is simpler. She walks beside him now, veiled, determined, clutching a letter that could upend the Empire if placed in the wrong hands. As they descend toward the ferry hidden among reeds at the harbour's edge, she realises the wind has shifted, carrying the scent of rain and something like freedom, and despite the danger clasping their heels, she feels an unfamiliar peace, the kind that arrives only when there is no longer any way to turn back. They cross into the Anatolian wilds, beneath a sky stretched thin with storm clouds, and each step along the muddy caravan path reminds her how far she has travelled from silk halls, yet she matches his pace steadily, trusting the way he studies every tree line as though reading a shifting script only seasoned soldiers ever learn to interpret. The wind grows colder as they follow an abandoned aqueduct toward the hills, and when thunder grumbles like a drowsy giant overhead, he guides her beneath a stone archway, explaining that Roman engineers once built these channels strong enough to survive centuries, though scholars still argue whether later repairs used limestone or a cheaper, more regrettable imitation. Rain begins its slow percussion on the stones around them, and he removes his cloak to shelter her shoulders despite her protests, which he silences with a small smile, the kind that reveals the quick warmth beneath his discipline, making the storm feel less like a threat and more like a curtain closing behind their old lives. They resume walking when the downpour softens, navigating goat trails braided between boulders slick with moss, and she notes how he avoids the deepest mud without thinking, how he senses the shift of wind before it whistles through the reeds, and she realizes tenderness can emerge in the quiet precision of someone constantly assessing danger. A quirky tale he shares to distract her from the climb is that some travellers swore the hills here echoed names if whispered at dawn, though when she tries softly saying his, only wind answers, and he laughs under his breath, telling her legends rarely perform on command, especially in weather this moody. Hunger edges into their journey by afternoon, and they pause near a stream where he produces dried figs and coarse bread from his satchel, apologizing for simplicity. Though she finds the meal strangely grounding, and as she eats she hears distant hoofbeats, faint but rhythmic, a reminder that pursuit is never as far behind as hope pretends. He leads her across a narrow footbridge cracked by time, pointing out that Byzantine border riders once patrolled this region before imperial funding shifted south. And the thought unsettles her, because it means fewer allies here, fewer eyes watching for enemies, and every choice now balances on instinct sharpened only by trust. Historians still argue whether fugitives of royal blood ever truly vanished into these vast highlands or were quietly returned to the capital, but tonight she feels invisible beneath the storm's lingering veil, moving through landscapes indifferent to lineage, guided only by the steady presence of the man who refuses to walk ahead or behind her. As the sun slips low, staining the valley in rust and ember hues, they find temporary refuge beneath a cypress grove where the ground is soft with fallen needles, and he assures her they will reach a safer region by tomorrow, though he admits the riders she heard earlier were likely not travelling by chance. Night folds around them gently, and while he keeps watch beside a wavering torch, she lies awake listening to wind comb through the trees, feeling the fragile thread between fear and comfort tighten, realizing that exile is no longer an idea but a path carved beneath their feet, lit by the quiet loyalty he never names. They reach the remote monastery just after dawn, its stone walls perched on a cliff overlooking a valley washed pale with morning mist, and the monks greet them with the calm indifference of men who have seen fugitives, pilgrims, scholars, and lost souls pass through their gates since the days when imperial borders shifted like restless tides. Inside, incense softens the air, curling around frescoes, flaking with age, and the abbot listens to their story without surprise, offering shelter in exchange for silence, reminding them that this monastery once protected dissenting theologians during the iconoclast period, a historical detail she recalls dimly from lessons she never thought would matter beyond polite conversation. He assigns them a small cell overlooking the courtyard garden, and as she steps inside she notices a wooden shelf filled with unlabelled scrolls, prayers, confessions, and half-legends left by travellers, while he explains the quirky tradition that anyone seeking refuge must write a single sentence about what they wish the world would forget. They spend the morning helping in the herb garden to avoid attention, and while sorting sprigs of rosemary she watches him speak quietly with a monk who seems to recognise the cut of his cloak. Though historians still argue whether former palace guards truly use secret gestures to identify each other in far-off sanctuaries, Later, in the refectory, a monk shares bread and honey with them, mentioning that messages sometimes arrive here from Constantinople weeks before official couriers, which chills her because it means word of her disappearance will reach this cliff long before pursuit ever tires, and she senses the weight of time tightening around them. By afternoon, the abbot leads them to a chamber filled with old votive tablets carved with names that no longer appear in imperial records, explaining that these inscriptions belong to people who renounced titles, families, or obligations. And she realizes with a slow ache that erasure here is not tragedy but mercy. He encourages them to leave no names of their own, only intentions, and as she presses her hand to cool stone, she understands that anonymity is not empty. It is a kind of rebirth, allowing them to step beyond identities constructed by lineage, expectation, and the sharp, politicized choreography of palace life. He takes her hand afterward, only briefly, but the gesture feels like a vow spoken without sound, and she sees in his expression the quiet certainty that exile has already reshaped them, binding their futures together in a way no royal decree or imperial marriage contract could ever replicate or control. That evening, they sit beneath the monastery's bell tower, watching swallows loop above the valley, and she feels the strange calm that follows prolonged fear, the mind settling after too much noise, realizing that this sanctuary holds the fragile border between what they were and who they are becoming. In the stillness, as the bell tolls softly and shadows lengthen across the courtyard, she senses the approaching choice: remain hidden in safety until the Empire forgets them entirely, or step once more into uncertainty, not as princess and guard, but as two exiles shaping a life no chronicle will adequately explain. They leave the monastery before dawn, on a morning washed in pale silver, following a narrow coastal path that winds between cliffs and wind-bent pines. And though neither speaks of it aloud, they both understand this is the final stretch, where sanctuary ends and the unnamed shape of their shared exile begins, fragile yet undeniably theirs. The sea roars below them with the force of something ancient, and he explains that traders once used this route to bypass imperial taxes, a historical fact that makes her smile despite exhaustion, because even in an empire built on ceremony and law, people always found secret ways to move toward the lives they wanted. Salt wind tugs at her cloak as they descend toward a scattered fishing village, a place so small it appears carved from driftwood and stubbornness, and he assures her they will not be recognized here. Coastal towns see fugitives, sailors, pilgrims, and outcasts so often that anonymity is treated with the same casual courtesy as greeting or bread. They rent a weathered hut overlooking the water, and as they clear dust from the floor, she notices an old loom pushed into a corner, threads tangled like forgotten promises, and the quirky widow who lends them the key claims, quite seriously, that the loom remembers good hands and might weave more steadily for her than for anyone else. Later, while repairing a cracked clay jar outside, he tells her the riders they feared likely abandoned the chase. Once word spread that imperial factions were turning against each other, though historians still argue whether her disappearance weakened the court's alliances or merely accelerated fractures already creeping beneath diplomacy's polished surface. Days stretch softly along the coastline, their rhythms shaped by fishing boats, the distant clatter of pots, and gulls carving white arcs across the sky, and she discovers that ordinary life carries a kind of sweetness she never learned within palace walls, where meals were ceremonial and silence weighed more than conversation. He finds work helping repair nets, his hands steady even through cold mornings, and she begins weaving again on that stubborn loom, the threads smoothing with each attempt until the cloth resembles a horizon at dusk, quite gold fading into twilight blue, an image that feels like the story they are slowly building. Some evenings they walk the beach as the tide retreats, the world reduced to soft sand, warm lantern light, and the steady rhythm of waves repeating themselves like a promise they do not need to articulate, and she realizes love has slipped into their days without ceremony or pronouncement. They keep no records of their names or histories, leaving only a few coins for the widow and a basket of woven cloth for the village before finding a cliffside cabin where the world narrows to wind, sea, and the lives they choose daily. Not ruled, not arranged, not witnessed. And on a quiet night when the waves whisper against the rocks and the moon spreads its silver blessing across their small home, she understands at last that they have not vanished from history. They have simply stepped into the part of it where chronicles fall silent and love continues unbeholden to empire. Night settles gently now, loosening itself across the coastline with the soft patience of something that has watched countless stories rise and fall, and the calm here feels different from the hush inside palace walls, less guarded, less ceremonial, more like a long breath finally being released after years held too tightly. The air drifts in slow, tender currents around their small cabin, brushing the wooden door frame, stirring the threads she left drying near the hearth, carrying the faint scent of sea salt and warm stone, letting you lean into the moment without asking anything in return. The world grows quieter with each passing heartbeat, as though the waves have learned to speak in murmurs instead of declarations, and their lives, no longer pressed into roles or expectations, unfold in rhythms as steady as the tide itself. You can almost imagine the lamp burning low inside that little room, its glow trembling like a tired star, casting soft halos over the woven cloth she finished earlier in the day. Outside, footsteps fade into the sand, leaving only the whispering sea to keep them company, and even that sound seems to hush itself out of courtesy. There's a gentleness that settles here, a slow unwinding of everything that once tightened around them. Duty, fear, urgency, the sharp lines of power that carved their lives before exile softened their edges. And perhaps that's the quiet truth beneath so many forgotten histories. Some stories don't end with triumph or tragedy, but with two people stepping into a silence deep enough to hold them safely. If you listen closely, you might hear the soft cadence of peace settling around them, not as an ending, but as a place to rest. End of script. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead. May everything unfold kindly for you.